Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. I tend to pace and walk while I'm talking, so I'm reluctant to get behind the microphone. My name is Simon Davies, and for the last 27 years I've been a consulting environmental scientist and wildlife biologist. Many of my clients are airports, and I work with those airports to manage wildlife. I originally, after graduating college, thought I would be a marine mammal trainer. I actually met my wife in an aquarium while we were both working there, but I realized I didn't look good enough in a wetsuit to get the good job. So I thought, I'll go work somewhere else. And I found this career that I find very rewarding. So, aviation wildlife management. We're going to go quickly. This is going to be at the 10,000 foot level. And hopefully you'll find it interesting. So, history of bird strikes. Does anyone know when the first flight was? The first airplane? Okay. When do you think the first bird strike was? That is the physical striking of a bird by an airplane in the air. September 7th, 1905. Orville Wright, I think it may have been on the third flight, struck a red-winged blackbird near Dayton, Ohio. First recorded fatality from a bird strike. This is bird striking airplane, causing airplane to crash, and resulting in the death of the pilot. 1912. So, 8 years after we had our first flight, basically, we've had, so as long as there's been planes in the air, wildlife hazards have been part of aviation. A wildlife strike, and this is what I alluded to, is defined as a pilot reporting striking one or more birds or other wildlife, not just birds are struck by airplanes. Aircraft maintenance personnel identifying aircraft damage as having been caused by wildlife. Personnel on the ground report seeing an aircraft strike birds. Wildlife remains, whether whole or in part, are found within 200 feet of the runway center line or on the side of an airplane, where the wildlife's presence had a significant negative effect on a flight. It means the physical presence of the wildlife on the airfield caused an alteration in the flight. Pilot had to abort a landing, abort a takeoff, alter a taxi pattern. All of those things are defined as a wildlife strike. Now, wildlife remains, whether whole or in part. Here's a little side note for you, a little piece of cocktail party knowledge. There is a technical term for the remains of a bird that's found on a plane. Snarge. It's a technical, honest to gosh, definition. Snarge is the smear that's left on a plane when a bird bounces up. So, to go back, we're just looking at modern history, we're not going to go all the way back to the early 1900s. But since 1990, so over the last just over 30 years, we have seen a tremendous increase in the number of reported wildlife strikes. Okay. Emphasis there is on reported. However, we have seen an increase in birds and other wildlife striking aircraft. This is due to a couple factors: expanding wildlife populations, waterfowl and geese populations, some of the most hazardous wildlife, have shown dramatic population growth for the last 20 years. 13 of the 14 North American bird species with a mean body mass that presents a significant hazard to aircraft have shown population increases, and large mammal species are increasing in population. We've seen an increase in air traffic. Domestic passenger enplanements, that's the number of people passing through an airport and getting on an aircraft, have risen from just over 310 million in 1980 to a reported 811.5 million in 2019. We're not including 2020 and 2021 in these numbers. They're an artificial dip. But you can see almost three times as many flights are happening. So there's a significant cost associated with wildlife strikes. These are all examples of wildlife striking large commercial aircraft. I have a whole other series of pictures at the end of my session that I'm not going to show you all. because they're a little disturbing, but I did move them to the end if anybody really wants to see them. So all of these are strikes not by very large birds. So this is blackbirds and starlings, but they can cause significant damage to the leading edges of wings.
A lot of snark.
Lot of snark. There was a strike that I was involved with at the Columbus Regional Airport down in Columbus, Indiana. And one of the Cummins Cummins corporate jets was taking off on a trip to Germany. And just after they took off from the ground, they ran through a flock of about 2,500 starlings. We've picked up over 500 from the runway. Both engines suffered ingestion of multiple birds. The back, where the exhaust went across the tail of this particular model of aircraft, it looked like somebody had used a grease knife. Just a blare. The leading edge of both wings were completely damaged. One engine was 90% loss of thrust, the other was 75% loss of thrust. They were able to land, turn around and land immediately, but it was over $10 million worth of damage on just that one aircraft. So it's estimated that it's over $2 billion in damage annually, and that only 40% of strikes are actually reported. If there's no damage and there's no alteration of flight, and there's just a smear or something on the side of the aircraft, it may or may not be reported. So what do we do? I mean, these wildlife strikes have been around since the very first part of aviation. We can do things. There are things that we can do that mitigate and minimize the potential hazard posed by this. This is actually a jet, I believe it's an F-14, that took a hawk to the nose. So the hawk looks a lot worse. What do we do? This audience is probably going to remember this, and I know one person absolutely will. Does anybody remember wind shear? So when I was younger in the 1970s and 1980s, I remember hearing there were some really terrible commercial airline crashes that were due to wind shear. And that's weather systems, strong downdrafts that force planes down to the ground. It's been 22 years, actually 24 now, since the last commercial accident due to wind shear. We've solved it by aircraft monitoring, pacing. OW can attest far more to this than I could, but we've been able to solve that problem. So we can do this with wildlife hazard. Looking at why isn't wildlife there, what's bringing them to the airport, what kind of wildlife is using the airport, and then coming up with solutions to solve it. We can do this passively. Habitat modification, basically take typical wildlife biology and flip it on its head. Instead of figuring out how do we get more wildlife in the airport, we want wildlife to go as far away from the airport as we can. We change the plants, we change how they're managed, we change mowing regimens. High grass is bad for really tall grass is bad, really short grass is bad. So most airports keep their grass between 7 and 14 inches. All of these different things can reduce the attractiveness of the airport to wildlife. Active control, go out and use pyrotechnics, other active discouraging methods, dogs, remote control drones, remote control boats, all of these things. If every time you came into this room and you came in through this door, somebody banged 2 pots by your head, pretty soon you'd be coming in the other door. Same principle. We make it unpleasant and unattractive, and they go somewhere else. One of the challenges with airports is that planes don't just stay within the airport, right? They take off and they fly over the adjacent land. So there are land uses around airports that can also result in the attracting of hazardous wildlife. Landfills, pretty much anything to do with garbage and waste, except for Angie's worms, because they're in her basement. recycling centers, stormwater, wastewater facilities, large bodies of water, even agricultural activities, especially during harvest or livestock production. So there's lots of things that can bring wildlife to the area, so we work with them. So I'm going to give you a real quick example of one very interesting project that I did. This is a small general aviation airport out in Hendricks County, Indiana, just east of Danville. This is known as Gordon Graham Field. It's under the Indianapolis Airport Authority umbrella. It's a small general aviation airport. But I'll point out from this aerial that 5,350 feet, that distance is important, away from the runway is a landfill. The reason that's important is when you start looking at turbine-powered aircraft, that's turboprop or jet engine aircraft, we need to look 10,000 feet away to look for these wildlife attractions. Propeller aircraft, it's only 5,000 feet, basically a mile, 5,000 square feet. So that's why I know exactly how far that is. Landfills attract vultures. Vultures, large, big-bodied birds, like to soar at about 500 feet level, which is the great level for pilots, commercial pilots, or private pilots that are making sure they qualify on their takeoff and landings. They like to take off, circle around, do touch and goes. So birds, airplanes, same level, challenging situation. So, how do you discourage birds from using a landfill? They love to feed on our waste. So this is a very large landfill. It's one of the largest in Hendricks County. It takes trash from the entire western side of Indianapolis, all the way up to Lafayette, and all the way down to Bloomington. We were doing counts, and my lovely wife came along this journey with me. We would have landfill dates, where we would go out and we would count birds utilizing the active face of where the trash is being dumped each night. And then I used biology. Vultures, turkey vultures in particular, are one of the few species that exhibit a distinct negative reaction to the presence of their own dead. Scarecrows don't work on crows, but a vulture effigy or a vulture carcass deters and discourages its fellow vultures from remaining in the area. So again, on a landfill date, I went out with frozen vulture carcasses that I had obtained completely legally through the USDA, and hung them out installed them on the landfill. You can see the active space behind you there. And we actually hung one right off the front of the timbers in the hopes that it would reduce the number of birds utilizing the landfill. The results surprised me. We went from an average of between 100 and 150 birds utilizing the landfill in May and June of the year. This is the installation point, and this is the installation point of the one on the tipper. We went to 0 birds observed feeding on that landfill. We still saw a handful, flying over the landfill, checking it out, but we saw an elimination of the use of that area by those birds. So we have solutions. We have this amazing toolbox of information that we can draw upon as airport wildlife biologists. It's very exciting. We had some pretty good dates on the landfill. So I could go on for days, but thank you all very much.
Oh, what about the rebound on your graph?
So the challenge is that a vulture carcass hanging in the sun has a limited lifespan. And that rebound...
Because it was worse than before.
Well, so that's also a time of year. So this is coming through August. Right now is the highest use by vultures because they're starting to migrate south.
Okay.
Vultures are migratory, and if you think about it, if you've ever eaten a stove-first meal without putting it in the microwave first, you understand why vultures move south.
Yeah.
Are your figures U.S. figures or I'm assuming they are?
U.S. only, yeah.
And are there global programs?
There is an organization called Bird Strike International. It's a collection of biologists like myself that I don't unfortunately get to go to all their meetings because they meet in places like Venezuela and South Africa, and my company won't foot the bill to send me to those. But yes, it is a problem, and it is the solutions are different everywhere depending upon the wildlife, but it is a global phenomenon.
Is it as much a problem when planes are flying over the ocean as it is when they're flying over land?
Very good question, and the answer is no. Most bird strike, most wildlife happens between ground and 1,500 feet above ground level. Most, it's about 90%. The next 9.9% happens in the next 1,000 feet of altitude. Once you get above 3,000 feet in elevation, above ground level, most wildlife is not found there. Birds can fly higher than that. The highest recorded bird strike, I think, is just over 15,000 feet, but it was a goose that hit a military transfer plane going over the Andes Mountains. So very rare circumstance.
So it's a matter of the altitude rather than the water in the ocean.
Exactly. It's really the altitude.
Does your work or the work of anybody in your field have to do with wind turbines? You see a lot of those probably in Indiana.
Yes. No, absolutely. Wind turbines, the potential impact of wind turbines on wildlife, be it bats, songbirds, or larger raptors and eagles, is one of the challenges with that energy generation mechanism, and is something that gets accounted for, or at least studied prior to the exam. Last question, I think.
Last one, okay, great. Can you go back to that earlier graph about the increase in bird strikes and the increase in passengers was 3 times? I was just interested, of course, does that account for almost all of it?
Well, this is the number of reported strikes. So there's two things going on here. One, we're seeing more aviation activity. We're also seeing a higher level of reporting. As the understanding is getting out there, as airlines and pilots understand the importance of us gathering this data, without the data, we can't solve the problem. So,
It's easier to report too.
yeah. We've also made it as, it used to be you had to fill out, like, the answer to almost 200 different questions. Now it's become much simpler and much more formalized. Thank you all so much again.
I do need a mic because I don't have a big voice. So I'm Becky Archibald. I'm a composer and a pianist and North Church member. About 5 years ago, I was part of this. I was one of about a dozen artists selected to be part of this fellowship called Religion, Spirituality, and the Arts. Maybe some of you have heard of it. And the group of us were to study together for maybe 6 months. We had different teachers coming in talking about those topics. And then we were to create something around the theme. And our theme that year happened to be creation and creativity. So I wrote this piece called Hums with Mother Earth. And we'll be sharing some of the movements, and I'll be telling you a little bit about my creative process. So what jump-started my idea was we had a poetry teacher stop by, and she gave each of us a paper bag with a mysterious piece of fruit inside. And then we had to write a poem on the spot as to why our fruit should have been the one selected for the Tree of Knowledge. Mine was a persimmon. It's curious, round, squat, firm, topped with a built-in fig leaf. It doesn't look tasty. It become a hellish lump of baked, brown, overly sweetened and spiced pudding. Or, if left in its natural state, love at first sight, when you open it up and see the stars. So as I kept working on my idea for my creation, I settled on 3 main goals. I wanted to create something new out of something old. And I was sharing with somebody that one of the things that we studied during that process was the Frankenstein story, which is very much about creation. And that helped with making this idea of wanting to make something new out of something old. I wanted to present the Adam and Eve story in a new way. And I wanted to make myself write very short musical movements, which is tricky to tell a story in a very short amount of time, as I have to do right now. So eventually an idea came, and I thought, what if the old nursery songs that we all know, but we don't know the origins of, what if they were created in the Garden of Eden, but they were darker and more complex? What if over time they morphed into something short and sweet? So I sat at the piano and started humming, and I just let my fingers flow. I had my tape recorder on. I didn't play the melodies of these old songs, I played the rhythm. I didn't play the harmonies, just the rhythm. And I played and played and thought about song after song, and maybe about 15 minutes later, I stopped and I turned back my tape recorder on and thought, But then I remembered my first grade teacher, Mrs. Kessler, had this game she would play with all of us, and she would walk around to each child's desk, and she would take her marker and draw a curved line, and then we were to create something out of it. We were supposed to see what wasn't there. We were supposed to finish it. We were supposed to see what the potential was. And so I vowed I was going to make something out of my musical squiggles that happened that day. I was going to keep them intact, but I was going to fill them in and finish them and see their potential. And unbelievably, this suite was born. And we're going to play some movements. For the last movement, I wanted to set the poem to music, which was a challenge with, it seems like every sentence is a new mood. So trying to make it hold together musically while changing moods every phrase, basically. And if anyone has any questions? Yeah?
I think there's a persimmon festival in Indiana.
I don't know. We'll have to go. When, do you know when? I guess we should. Is it happening right now? Will we? Anyone else? Oh, yeah.
If you perform this to the public, does the illustration and the explanation go with it, or do we just listen to the music?
Well, this is only the third, maybe performance, and I never thought to have the information side by side. I think it's helpful. I don't know. Did you find it helpful to have kind of like you'd have a program, but yeah.
I think it would be attractive without that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we were talking about, is it program music, or what's the other word for when it doesn't, when it's not about absolute? Yeah, is it program absolute? Yeah, so sometimes it's like in the movement called Infinite Beyond. And my rhythmic source is the Eensy Weensy Spider, da, 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 except, it sounds totally different than the Eensy Weensy Spider, but there are points in it where it definitely sounds like the spider is descending, and definitely sounds like the spider's trying to work its way up and falling. And then the other parts are like, nah, it's just pure music. So.
You did the art or photography for that, and did you compose the part with the violin?
How was it?
Oh yeah. And there were 3 of them that had the artist's name listed. Okay, and in the back, I don't remember the names, but they are listed there. I found the spiderweb one online, and I couldn't find a credit for that one, but everything else was. And yeah, I compose all the parts. So when I'm writing for orchestra, I write tuba, and I write for everybody. Even though I grew up just playing the piano, it's kind of like a playwright. You write for all the characters. Thanks.
Let me just mention real quickly between presenters that almost all our presenters are staying for lunch and will be seated at tables in the back when you're eating lunch, so you can sit with them and ask them questions also during the lunch break.
Very good. Follow up, the Persimmon Festival is in Mitchell, and it was September 17th to 27th.
So get it on your calendar for next year.
back and check my notes occasionally. So I'm Heather Maybury. I'm with Earth Mama Compost, and I would like to chat with you today about the environmental impacts of composting.
You're wonderful.
I love you, Charlotte. A couple of the topics I will kind of touch on today. First, I'm going to talk about why composting is so powerful for our environment, how it improves our soil, and what we can do in our own homes to make a real difference. So, the impact of food waste is where I'll start. Something that we don't always think about is that when we throw our food into the trash can, it doesn't go anywhere. It might go to the landfill, but it's going to sit there for possibly decades. There was a gentleman by the name of William Rathje at the University of Arizona, and he did archaeological digs on 19 landfill sites across the United States. What he found is the food waste just kind of gets encapsulated because it's got, you have plastic on top of plastic on top of plastic, right? And so he found a 24-year-old pile of guacamole. He found, I know, right? Like you can't sit it on the countertop for a couple of hours without it starting to oxidize. He found a 40-year-old steak. I think there was a baguette that was a decade old. And so the problem is not only the space that it takes up in our landfills as it sits there entombed. The problem is that the whole time it's sitting there, it's putting off gases. Carbon, we know about, right? But it also puts off methane gas. Firstly, if you put that same food waste into the compost pile, it's going to sit there for a month, maybe 3 months, depending on what it is. And it's going to put off the carbon for that period of time instead of decades. And in an aerobic environment, it will not put off methane. So we've eliminated that issue altogether. Now we have to talk about the great part about composting, right? And that's using it. So, first I'm going to talk, I think I might have skipped something. I get excited, sorry. All right. And we'll hit it later. So, when we use our compost, there are some magical things that happen, right? So, instead of using a fertilizer that's going to make you have this like big, beautiful, amazing plant, when you use compost, you get a smaller plant that's actually healthier. And the reason is that the cell structure is appropriately sized. The fertilizer is going to make a larger cell, which has a thinner cell wall, and that allows for drought to be more of an issue, and it allows for disease to get into that cell structure, killing your plants. You have more balanced soil, and what I found is interesting is that when your soil is balanced, you actually get less weeds, because weeds are the symptom of imbalance. You can actually go Google crazy, fall down the rabbit hole when you have a weed and say, what is needed in this soil because I have this weed? And then amend the soil and get rid of the weed, instead of using pesticides to kill the weed. Sorry. The last thing that I just learned about recently is, has everybody heard of carbon traps? Okay, so nature has a carbon trap, multiple carbon traps. Rocks, trees, the soil, the ocean. I'm sure there are more. Anyway, if our soil is imbalanced or weak, it can't hold on to carbon as long. So right now we have pretty poor soil in our country, because we do all kinds of crazy things. So it's holding carbon for between 50 and 100 years. It used to hold carbon for about 1,000 years. There was a lady in California who did studies on pastured grazing land, And she was trying to enrich the soil so that, to see what the environmental impact was. She put a ½ inch of compost over, I think it was 1,600 acres or something, and found that that ½ inch of compost actually enriches the soil to a depth of 6 feet. Isn't that amazing? That makes me so happy. So, what really kind of strikes me about this information, yes, it's disturbing how much food waste goes to the landfill. I think it's 36 million tons of food waste just in the U.S. that goes to the landfill. And only about a year. Yeah, and that's probably 5 years old because it's the EPA. So that information is ever changing, I'm sure. Only about 5% of that is composted at this point. But almost 50% of that food waste comes from homes, which gives us the power to make the change, right? We have 146 million acres of residential land in this country. We have the power to make real change just by educating. So, what you can do, reduce your food waste on the front end, okay? I like to make my meal list for the week and then make my grocery list from my meal list and then eat the perishable stuff first, unless I'm not in the mood for it, then I make that the next day, right? And then feed people. Always feed as many people as you can with the food you have. If you can't feed people, feed animals. This is the hierarchy of food waste. After you've fed everyone you can, then compost, right? And if you can't compost it, worst case scenario, last option is to throw it in the trash. So, if you want to compost at home, there are probably, I don't even know how many options that you can choose. Vermicomposting, you can buy one of those fancy schmancy little composters that sit on your countertop. You can go to Cornell University's website and Google composting. It's a great information. And you can find out how to do it on your own in your home. If you don't have the space or the time, find a neighbor that's already composting and see if you can add your goodies to theirs. If all else fails, there are companies like mine that will come and pick it up just like you're recycling. And take it to the compost pile and make sure that it goes to the right place. There are actually 4 of us around the area. So you have Earth Mama Compost, that's me. I should be able to remember that. Green with Indy. And Indigo Green. And up in Westfield there is, who is she? RE317. So, tons of options on ways to compost. So, I want to, at home, if you're able to, spread a ½ inch of compost over your grass and just let it go. You'll get less weeds, you'll restore your soil, and reduce the carbon impact that you have in your home. But I want to dream for just a second, if I can. If you guys could imagine if we could entice our governments to make one simple rule. Every time ground is broken and construction is finished, the land has to be covered with a ½ inch of compost before grass is planted. Can you imagine the environmental impact of that one simple act? Okay, I'm done. Thank you. Are there any questions?
What's the name of your company?
I'm sorry?
What is the name of your company?
Earth Mama Compost.
Earth Mama Compost. All one.
You can put it all one word, or you can spread it out. It doesn't matter. Google knows. Oh, good. I'm loud.
Oh, I just wondered if you could repeat the name of the 4 companies. You obviously, Earth Mama Compost is one, but what were the other 3?
RE317 is Northern Carmel and Westfield.
Aria?
RE.
R-E, okay.
And then 317. We have Green with Indy.
Green with Indy, okay.
Yeah, and he's, I think he's mostly Marion County. I haven't talked to him since before COVID, so I don't know what's happening with him. I know he's still around though. And then we have a new lady who just started this year, I believe, and she is Indigo Green. Indigo Green.
Okay, Indigo Green, okay.
And when you forget all that, Heather's staying for lunch, so she'll be available.
One last question.
No, she's not. Yes,
Heather, how many customers do you have?
I have 750 homes right now. I used to do schools before COVID hit, and we grew so much after COVID that we just don't have the capacity to take on schools. I wish I did. I love working with the kids.
I've been composting with them for several years, and I'll vouch for them.
Jan is also staying for lunch.
All right, so I'm not going to use a microphone. I will use my teaching voice, though. So if you can't hear me, there's a microphone right there, and we can turn that on. I will also try not to scream at the people in the front. So my name is Stephanie Schuck, and I am going to turn on my timer like I promised I would, because I can go on and on and on. So I will not do that today. I am staying for lunch. I do also have a table over here, the yellow tablecloth, with all kinds of information. Feel free to take any of the brochures. I put some books out, though, as examples. Please don't take my books. Just take a look at them. So I will be here to talk about all kinds of things. So as I mentioned, my name is Stephanie. I am the Executive Director of the State of Indiana Cooperative Invasives Management. We'll just call that SICM from now on. We love our acronyms, so SICM. And what we do is we help to manage invasive plants in Indiana. So my former lives, I was a restoration ecologist. I've been an environmental educator for years. And I want to talk about invasives today, but I only have 10 minutes, and that's not enough time to take you into the doom and gloom and then to bring you up again. So I'm going to talk a little bit about invasives, but I'm also going to, really what I want to focus on is what I've done personally to help mitigate some of the issues that invasive species cause, personally at my own property, and then what I do to help people as well. So I could have called this, and maybe I should have called this 1 yard at a time. I think that's what it should be. But essentially, we're gardening for wildlife. And so when we do this, I need to talk about what a native plant is and what an invasive plant is. So what is a native plant? So we go, SICM, and I, myself, go by the general definition, the federal definition, which is it has naturally occurred in an area long enough to evolve a relationship with the wildlife there. So the wildlife there relies on those species. They eat them, they live in them, they have babies in them, they live around them, and they rely on them. And usually what that means is pre-European settlement, so pre-colonization. So as I mentioned, they've co-evolved with these species. They have created these natural communities. So biology is a study of all living things. Ecology is a study of the relationships between those things and their environment. So I'm an ecologist, so I get super nerdy about this kind of stuff because there's so many relationships, there's so many things going on that we don't know and we might never know. So I am always learning, and that is fantastic. I love it. So I'm going to talk a lot about specialists here. So specialists are basically animals that rely on something for part of or possibly their entire lives. I'll talk a little bit about monarch butterflies. They're kind of like our poster child for specialist species. What do monarch caterpillars eat? Milkweed, right? No milkweed, no monarchs. End of story, right? So that's the definition of a specialist. So what is an invasive species? So they are non-native, two things, non-native and they cause harm. So we have lots of non-native plants, lots of non-native species in the United States right now, but less than 2% of them are considered invasive. So when I use the word invasive, I'm not talking about dandelions in your grass, because neither of those, number one, are native. But the dandelions aren't causing me a problem in forests when I'm doing restoration, right? So when I talk about invasive species, they're causing harm to our natural environment, our ecosystems. They can also cause harm in our human health harm as well. Poison hemlock is a good example of that. So that's a non-native plant, and if you touch it, it will give you dermatitis pretty badly. So you might break out in a rash. There are some other species that do that too. So it has to cause some sort of harm. How it does this? A lot of them have no natural predators because they haven't evolved in that area. Nothing eats them. Nothing uses them, for the most part. There are some invasive plants that I see that might have some nibbles on them, and some bees might visit the flowers. But for the most part, they have no natural predators, so they can just go free, right? So there are lots of other ways that they can affect things, but like I said, I'm going to give you a little taste of all of these things, and then I'm here to talk about it as much as you want. So they negatively impact, as I mentioned, our environment, our natural resources, biodiversity. So this is really what I want to talk about. There are lots of other things here too. Water quality, soil health, as I mentioned, human, animal, and plant health, biodiversity. So what invasives do is they move in, they take over, they push everything out, and they lower the biodiversity. So wetlands, for example, are highly diverse ecosystems. If you have one plant that moves in and takes over and pushes everything out, that, by the way, nobody eats. What good is that, right? So what that also does then, that affects the ecosystem services that those wetlands provide. So when I say ecosystem services, what I mean is they provide things for us. So wetlands, even though they're highly diverse and they have lots of different types of plants to support lots of different types of wildlife, they're also doing things for us. Flood mitigation, they help to clean toxins out of our water. They do lots of things for us. And if they're not able to function properly because they have an invasive species that's taken over, then they don't provide those services for us. So they are a leading cause for lowering biodiversity. So I talked about monarch populations, or monarchs. So the monarch population declined by 80% in the last 2 years. That's
20 years.
Oh yeah, 20 years, sorry. I can't even tell you how I feel about that one. The North American bird populations declined over 25% over a 50-year period. More than 75% decline over 27 years in total flying insect biomass. So I'm a bug nerd. I love bugs. I know not everybody does. That's okay. You don't have to love them as much as I do. But what you have to understand is they have their place, right? So what eats bugs? Everything, right? Everything eats bugs. So they are important, and they also eat other bugs. So they're super important in these ecological relationships. The global population of mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fish have suffered an average 2/3 decline in less than half a century, and a lot of that has to do with that insect population too. What's that got to do with your yard? Well, I'll tell you. We need to do more of that, less of that, right? So we need to have, and maybe not exactly like that, but you need to have more diversity in your yards. We need to be planting native plants. So when I started this years and years ago, and I still get crazy looks, right? So using native plants in your landscaping is still not the norm. I get like, what? I told my neighbor years ago, I was like, oh, I planted milkweed. She was like, why did you do that? Because it's been considered a weed, right? So it's about education. So this is one thing that we do, is we help to educate the people. I do it in my job. It's a way of life for me, both in educating and also doing it at home. We need to think in terms of habitat and biodiversity. So these are my yard, except for that, that's not my yard. But that's not pretty, right? It's not pretty to our eyes. We need to retrain our eyes. We need to get away from the mulch pasta, mulch boxwood, mulch pasta, mulch perfectly round tree that isn't native to here. It's not doing anything. So function to me is beauty. I want to see the leaves being eaten. I want to see bugs out there. Talk about 2020. We can go anywhere. Well, I've got almost 2 acres, and I have a rain garden. I've been putting native plants in for years. Every day I went out taking pictures. Most of the pictures you see here are from my own yard. Say yes to the native plants, which it is easier now than it ever has been to find native plants. You still have to look for them. I've got information over here. We can talk about it at lunch too. I can tell you where to go to find them. These are service berries. How many of you have eaten service berries? Yeah, they're delicious, right? But there were so many this year. I don't know what, there was a boom in service berries. And usually I just let the birds have them. So I'm not very good at feeding myself, so I plant some tomatoes. I suck at it, I'm not good. They're okay, but I'm really good at feeding wildlife. So I let the farmers feed me, and then I feed the wildlife. I don't put bird feeders out. The diversity in birds that I see in my yard, because I've got service berries and dogwoods and flowers flowering at different times, and host plants, right? So flowers are important for pollinators, but if you don't have the host plants, like for example, those milkweed leaves that they rely on, then you're not gonna get it. So like I mentioned, understand the bigger picture. Embrace all of our insect friends. You don't have to like that cute little spider like I do, but appreciate its existence. There's my timer. So what else can you do? These are some of the things you can do. Go native, volunteer. We do weed wrangles. We remove invasive species. Educate, talk to your neighbors, your HOA. If you're on the HOA board, come and talk to me. Learn, continue to learn. There's so much information out there. And I want to leave you with this. So I'm not as eloquent as everybody else was, but I will really try. So this is one of my most favorite quotes. I'm going to leave you with this. When I heard this, it's like the skies opened up and I was like, oh yes. Because I said, people look at me and they're like, wait, you did what? Why are you doing that? That's not pretty. I'm like, oh, but it is, because come here, let me show you this and this and this and this. So I heard this and I was like, this is exactly what I feel. So your garden is a protest. It's a place of defiant compassion. It's a space to help sustain wildlife and ecosystem function while providing an aesthetic response that moves you. For you, beauty isn't just petal deep, but goes down into the soil, farther down into the aquifer, and back up into the air, and for miles around on the backs and legs of insects. You don't have to see the microbes in action, birds eating seeds, butterflies laying eggs, ants farming aphids. Just knowing that it's possible in your garden thrills you. It's like faith, and it frees you to live life more authentically. Your garden is a protest for all the ways in which we deny our life by denying other lives. Plant some natives. Be defiantly compassionate. Thank you.
One last presenter here. I will mention, if you come to worship tomorrow, I believe there's native plant seeds being given out after worship, so you can get yourself some no-charge native plant seeds to get going.
Hello. My name is Dygert-Gearheart. I'm a retired United Methodist pastor, retired from the North Indiana Conference. My last parish was First Wayne Street. And we are so happy to be here, to be invited to talk to you a little bit about a concern that we have.
And I'm Anita Dygert-Gearheart. I'm a retired clinical social worker, retired from serving as CEO. Is that better? Yeah. You're better now. Of a child welfare agency up in Northwest Indiana. And in 2005, Bob and I both retired, and we moved to the Cascade Mountains in Southern Oregon and lived totally off the grid.
We were living the dream, my dream, A life of exuberance, if you please, enjoying every moment, believing that how could this possibly be? We winter in Arizona, and one day we were on a road trip down to Bisbee. Anybody know where Bisbee is? One, all right. Well, on this trip we tuned in the radio to listen to a podcast, and we were suddenly awakened to something we had not realized before. And that was that the world was in crisis. An existential crisis called the climate crisis. We were alarmed and surprised and chagrined over the fact that now at my age I had no clue of what people were warning us of.
Kind of felt like we were Saul getting turned into Paul with that moment of enlightenment. And then 2020 came, and you know what else came with 2020? Well, COVID-19, we call it COVID-19, but we think of it as being 2020. And during that time, we moved to Spokane, Washington from Oregon, and remodeled the house. And then it was 2021, January of 2021, we were in lockdown mode in a new community. We didn't really know anybody. And we really felt called that year to study this thing we had heard about, the climate crisis or the climate warming or whatever it was, and try to get a handle on it for ourselves.
So we learned that we are facing a predicament with no easy solutions, no easy answers, and what we were going to do. So we started reading books, reading all the scientific documentation, reading books of people who have opinions, reading and listening to podcasts and watching television. And more, we decided that something needed to be done. So we joined the United Methodist Church's Earth Keepers, and that became a part of our study as well.
And one of the things we learned in that process was the importance of a strong grassroots movement. And so we said, okay, we really need to be a part of helping to create this grassroots movement. How can we do that? And what's in every community? And of course, all our lives, we said faith groups. Faith groups are in every community. And this could be really a vehicle for creating a strong grassroots of not only understanding, but also of action.
So we decided what we really needed in every local church was a curriculum that people could study and learn and understand what was going on. So we contacted the publishing house in Nashville, and to our great surprise, and again, a chagrin, there was no curriculum. There is no curriculum. So we thought, well, okay, maybe that's something that we should take seriously. As a former pastor and former members of the United Methodist Church, or current members of the United Methodist Church, we felt like we needed to do something.
So there were lots of materials available. Lots of materials about the climate crisis, and some curriculums even for our youth in our churches. But we couldn't find anything that really was a curriculum for the laity of faith groups.
So I remember that when I was very young, I received a call from God to the ministry. And I took that seriously in 42 years of ministry in the United Methodist Church. But I was unprepared for the call that came next, which was to create a curriculum. Now, I know nothing about writing curriculums. And I didn't feel qualified. But driving down the road a few days ago, I saw this sign on the United Methodist Church. It said, God does not call the qualified. God qualifies those who are called. And so that meant to me that, yes, we needed to move ahead in addressing this issue.
So here it is. It's on the board up there. And this curriculum is currently available on this website, Wake Up World, a comprehensive curriculum on the climate crisis for faith and community groups. It's free of charge. We've underwritten the development of this because we feel so passionately about the issue of the climate crisis and the world we're leaving for our children and our grandchildren and your children and your grandchildren too.
And the great thing about this curriculum is that it's very simple. It can be facilitated even by people who think they can't facilitate. And so we encourage you to look at it and to read it. And we will be back at the table, and if you have questions about that, we'll talk to you.
How many of you have green teams in your faith groups? We think it is a wonderful source for green teams. Now, maybe your green teams are already so educated that they don't need this, but we find with many green teams, it's a way to really bring people together, provide a basic understanding so that as you decide how you're going to move forward, it really gives you information on where it might be most impactful to act in your own community. And when you finish studying this, you will know the basic science that 99.9% of the scientists agree upon, the climate scientists. You'll also know how the choices that we make in our daily lives impact the climate crisis. You'll have looked at the thorny problem of climate justice, or I like to call it climate injustice, because that's more what it is. You'll find out who can play a part and how they can play a part in the solutions, and also find hope and movement to action.
I know our time is up, but I want to compliment those folks who have come before us who are talking about really nitty-gritty issues, all of them important and essential. And I hope that we've all learned something from that. But I want to end with something that Catherine Hayhoe. Anybody know Catherine Hayhoe? Right. She's a scientist. She's an evangelical Christian. And she has a statement for all of us to hear. She says, the climate crisis is real. We are causing it. It's serious. And we need to act now.
And I'm going to say one more thing, though Bob says our time's up. We still have 30 seconds. And that's another quote from Catherine Hayhoe about hope. She says, hope is an essential part of motivating people to take action on the climate change and in providing the emotional state for facing the challenging realities of our current crisis. And what we've tried to do is to provide hope through understanding. We hope you'll think about facilitating it in your groups, or if you just want to study it individually, you can do that. On our website, there's an individual study piece as well.
And thank you, North Church.
Well, actually, this last one will be a good segue into Tim Eberhart's presentation, which we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back. So, good time to stretch your legs. Restrooms are just out the door and down the hallways.
Well, it's my pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Timothy Eberhart, whom I had the great pleasure of meeting some years ago in a reflection group that I'm a part of. And about 5 years ago, Tim was here to present at that time and preach. So we're glad to actually have him back with us. Dr. Eberhart is the Robert and Marilyn Degler McLean Associate Professor of Ecological Theology and Practice, and the director of the Center for Ecological Regeneration at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, which is up in Evanston, Illinois, one of our United Methodist related seminaries. He is also the author of Rooted and Grounded in Love, Holy Communion for the Whole Creation, and is a graduate of St. Olaf College and Vanderbilt University. Tim is a ordained elder in the United Methodist Church and a member of the Dakota's annual conference. And as he's down in the Chicagoland area, serves as a member of the Bishop's Task Force on Sustainability in the Northern Illinois annual conference. And it is my pleasure to welcome him. Let's give him a round of applause.
Brian, thank you for the introduction. And before you walk away, Darren, let me ask, would it be possible to turn the monitor around so I could see the gathered space?
Let me.
Wonderful. Thank you.
How's that?
So that's great, Brian. I appreciate that very much. In fact, I see a friend, Jake Ohlmiller, in the front. Good to see you, friend. Brian, thank you again for the kind introduction and for the honor of your invitation to provide the lecture for this year's Dick and Anna Lee Hamilton series. I am so terribly sorry that I cannot be with you all in person this weekend. Of all the weeks, after 2.5 years, this happened to be the week that I had my first bout with the COVID virus. But I very much appreciate the flexibility on your end and your willingness to allow me still to share with you from our home here in Evanston. And I suppose it's simply a reality of our time that the harms we are doing to the earth are creating wounds that we too are experiencing. So I'm going to share my screen. And could you confirm that you're seeing the PowerPoint slide? Great. There's a story, one you may have heard, about a young man just under 30 years old who goes on something of a vision quest in the wilderness. The world around him is rife with conflict and tension amidst oppressive social conditions. And like so many shamans and seers and prophetesses before him, he ventures out, far away from the conveniences and the comforts of city life, to get clear about who he is and what he is to do, not only with his own life, but for the sake of the people. Now, this is an ancient rite of passage tested over millennia for those driven by spirit, not entirely of their own volition, to discern the deeper truths. Not in the built sanctuary or among the priests with their scrolls filled with words, nor surrounded by the thought leaders or the politicos. Instead, he heads into the wild by himself, without food, though he is not alone. He keeps company with the animals, the wild beasts, and is both visited by angels and tempted by demons. He remains like this for nearly 6 weeks, alone and not at all alone in the wilderness, before he returns with good tidings to share for all who have ears to hear. Now, this is a pattern he will repeat throughout his life, retreating into the mountains, departing to the lake shore, and withdrawing to the sacred groves to pray, to listen, and to discern what is the right and the good and the faithful thing to do. Of course, you know this young man, child of Mary, son of Joseph. His name, Yeshua, means salvation. And the path that he walks is the way of healing. It was spring 2014, just over 8 years ago. I was speaking with a Lakota organizer in Rapid City, South Dakota, my home state, following a panel we were on at First United Methodist Church as part of a creation care weekend, much like this one. And in the midst of our conversation, one in which I would first learn about the organizing efforts that would lead to the resistance at Standing Rock, she said to me, "You white people need to deal with your own intergenerational traumas. Our people are doing this work, but you European Americans, you too were cut off from your old traditions. You too lost sacred relationship with the land. There's so much violence in your histories. And until you find healing for your people and peace with the land, your people are going to continue to do harm to us others and to the earth." "50 years ago, Vine Deloria Jr., author of God is Red, A Native View of Religion, published in 1972, pointed to an unconscious longing rooted in a fundamental alienation in what he called the collective psyche of white America. He saw it manifest especially among Christians or former Christians in attempts to find authenticity in native spirituality, Eastern religions, environmental movements, or various communitarian efforts, some way of having a stable identity tied to a people, a tribe, connected to a place, and rooted in a deep sense of belonging. Now, Deloria, a member of the Standing Rock Sioux Nation, was the son and grandson of Episcopalian priests and a graduate of the Lutheran School of Theology in Rockford, Illinois. And so his observation that white people in America see in tribal religions the experiences and reverence that are missing in their own heritage was an insight rooted both in an intimate and a critical experience of Christianity. 1972, the year I was born, was also the year that the Club of Rome warned in a famous publication that exponential growth in population and Western levels of consumption, if left unaddressed, would collide with the limits of the Earth's biosphere and destabilize the foundations of planetary life as we know it. 20 years later, in 1992, the Union of Concerned Scientists stated, quote, "We, the undersigned senior members of the world's leading scientific community, hereby warn all humanity of what lies ahead. A great change in our stewardship of the earth and the life on it is required if vast human misery is to be avoided and our global home on this planet is not to be irretrievably mutilated." Over a decade ago, Nobel Prize winning atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen introduced the term Anthropocene to communicate the fact that we now live in a new geologic era. We no longer live in the age of the Holocene, the 12,000 year period of relative planetary stability, which supported the rise of human civilizations worldwide. Instead, human activities, anthropogenic changes, have replaced broader natural processes as the dominant geophysical force impacting the earth and its many interconnected systems. 2 years ago, the World Wildlife Fund published a report detailing the reality that over the last half century, 2/3 of all animal life on the planet have been annihilated. as the Living Planet 2020 report concluded, quote, "The findings are clear. Our relationship with nature is broken." So the task of our time, of this generation, is immense. We must repair our human relationship with more than human nature through a deep transition of all our activities, economic, political, cultural, social, institutional, from patterns of life degradation to the regeneration and sustainment of life, what Thomas Berry called the great work. And although that is work for all the world's wisdom traditions, we gathered today are responsible for the Christian tradition. And I, as a theologian, am particularly responsible for the Christian beliefs that we teach and believe and pass on to the next generation. To be even more specific, I'm a European American theologian, and that makes me especially responsible for we Christians whose histories trace back to Europe. Now, here's what I believe. To make this transition, we are going to need to reconnect with the land, and not just as stewards or as caretakers, but at a much deeper, more spiritual level. Now is the time and the hour is late to reconnect with the sacredness of the land. And by land, I mean the soil, the leaf, the sparrow, the oak tree, and the newborn fawn. I mean the thistles in your garden and the wasps making a home beneath your awning. I mean the wind and the rains and the heat and the ice, the dragonfly and the bear and the mycelia growing up out of rotting tree trunks. As the great nature writer Barry Lopez wrote, we once had a fundamental sense of well-being that grew directly out of our intimacy, our back and forth with the profundity embedded in the places we occupied. But in order to serve progress, it was deemed necessary for us actively to refute the assertion of indigenous cultures worldwide that the land is sentient. Because once place is stripped of spirit, then any destructive scheme for profit will fly. So I am saying to you that we need to recover a deep spirit of reverence, and I'll even say worship of the sacred life that pulsates within the whole of the natural world. But here's the problem. For many Christians, maybe most, what I'm invoking here creates something of an internal scare, or at least a small case of psychic discomfort. This language sounds dangerous. It's probably heretical because, well, it's pagan. And every good Christian, even the most progressive among us, knows there's nothing worse than for something or someone to be pagan. Now, one way of dealing with this might be to convince you that what I'm proposing isn't really pagan, but is in fact deeply and truly Christian. And I do want to activate your Christian piety. But now is a time for boldness. Too much is at stake. So I'm going to attempt to address this head on. I am asking you, as Christians, to rekindle something of the pagan spirit in your religious devotion and practice. I'm asking you to become pagan Christians or Christian pagans. Stick with me. The word itself, pagan, from the Latin paganus or pagus, in its original usage, simply meant of the country, rustic, rural, the area outside the city. In Roman usage, a particular section of farmland or a strip of land was known as a pagus. And those who lived with and from the land, those who lived outside the city, were in adjectival form, paganus. So another translation then could be peasant. Oftentimes, those words contained pejorative meanings. For the urban dweller, paganus could mean uncivilized or uncultured, those backwoods country bumpkin pagani. Roman soldiers who were mobile would often refer to those rooted in a particular place as the pagana, or you could say the locals, the commoners. They were native to their places. As has been the case for all indigenous land-based cultures on every continent from the ancient past up to the present, the worship life of these land-based pagani would have been characterized by a knowledge, a reverence, and a healthy respect of the spirit of their places. The Roman scholar Marcus Terentius Varro described a variety of ceremonies, rituals, feasts, and sacrifices attuned to the numen, or the divine presences native to a particular pagus, or an area of land. In one early ceremony, following the preparation of a field for farming, he records an address that would have been offered to the spirit of the field, given to quote, "thee for whom this land is sacred." Now, what he described, again, was true not just of early Roman agricultural religious practice, but would have been common across every land and culture throughout the ancient European world, as well as the tribal religions of Africa, the native traditions of North and South America, and the comparable animistic traditions of the East, like Shintoism. Among these traditions, which are the oldest and the most universal forms of human religiosity, among these traditions, the animating powers of divinity are found not within human-made temples or set-aside sacred objects, but in the more than human phenomena of enchanted forests, sacred springs, holy rivers, revelatory mountain peaks, and enchanted fields. According to historian Lynn White Jr. in his classic 1967 essay in Science magazine titled "The Historic Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis," it was precisely the destruction of these understandings and practices by the dominant forms of Western Christianity, which ultimately led to the deep alienation in the modern world between human and more than human life. In antiquity, he wrote, quote, "Every tree, every spring, every stream, every hill had its own guardian spirit. Before one cut a tree, mined a mountain, or dammed a brook, it was important to placate the spirit. By destroying pagan animism, Christianity made it possible to exploit nature in a mood of indifference to the feelings of natural objects. The great historian of late antiquity, Peter Brown, similarly notes that with the rise of the Latin Church in Europe, the fundamental relationship between humans and nature was altered, which caused profound changes in the landscape itself. The church, he writes, attacked precisely those points at which the natural and the divine were held to meet, cutting down the sacred trees, breaking up ancient ceremonial practices linking humans to their environs, and condemning all forms of piety based on the close observation of animal and vegetable life, or the turning of the sun, the moon, and the planets. Now, in light of this history, comparative religion scholar Braun Taylor argues for the replacement of the world's monotheistic traditions today, including Christianity, with what he calls the emergent dark green religion, expressed by radical environmentalists or those drawn toward eco-psychology and groups who embrace new scientific understandings of reality itself as sacred. Interestingly enough, White himself came to a different conclusion, ending his essay by pointing to Saint Francis as the patron saint of ecologists. As he wrote, since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, the remedy must also be religious. In Francis, who he called the greatest radical in Christian history since Christ, we see a kind of panpsychism of all things, animate and inanimate, which deposes humans from their monarchical rule over other creatures in place of a deep democracy of all God's creatures. So which is it? Or what will it be? Is Christianity intrinsically incompatible with the paganus, earth-rooted disposition? And if so, shouldn't those of us committed to a deep environmental ethic leave the Christian faith behind, like so many, especially in the West, already have? Or might we, followers of Jesus, those of us who are now stewarding the Christian tradition, might we, like Francis, actively embrace forms of piety that are rooted in the land and that cultivate a spiritual reverence for the environs that we inhabit? Well, you know my answer. Not only do I believe that we might, I am convinced that we must. With the time that we have, I can only be suggestive, but at a broad level, let me first suggest that we find something of a preferential option for the people of the land, those indigenous to the land throughout the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures. Think about it. In the founding narrative of the Bible, the Exodus from Egypt, an enslaved people is led out from the empire of Pharaoh's pyramidal society by way of a series of environmental plagues. And then by fire and cloud, they are led out into wilderness, where they are sustained and fed by the land, disciplined by the land, and ultimately reshaped into a different kind of society, prepared to inhabit a new land, a fruitful land, flowing with the ways of justice and peace. And when this society, Israel, returns to the ways and the means of imperial command and control, when the economic systems extract from those who tend to the land, the shepherds, the farmers, the wine and fig owners, when farmhouse is added to farmhouse and field is added to field, so that the people of the land are displaced, when the poor have their faces ground into the dust of the earth, notice that the prophetic cries for justice rise up from people like Amos, a sheep herder and a sycamore fig grower, and people like Micah, a poor farmer from the lowlands of Judah. In fact, think of how prominent of a role shepherds play throughout the scriptures. James Perkinson goes so far as to say that pastoral nomadism emerges in this time as the first social movement in history. Herders taking their flocks and exiting empire to live on the land beyond the reach of extractive control, seeking continuously to reconvene the possibility of a land-based existence. They, the ones who read the stars and the storms, who drink direct from the rivers, whose feet are rooted directly on the ground, these are the ones time and again visited by angels with tidings of great joy. Think here of John the Baptist, radical social critic, companion of camels and locusts and wild honeybees, the one whose voice cries out from the wilderness. Of course, Jesus himself was from Galilee, a rural province on the edge of the empire, which for the urban elite of Jerusalem, a Roman-occupied cosmopolitan city, made him inherently uncivilized, ignorant, a nobody. As biblical scholar Aubrey Hendricks notes, the priestly class denigrated Galileans by calling them the Ami Haaretz, which literally means the people of the land, the natives. Jesus was country. He spoke with a rural accent. I mean, can anything good come out of Nazareth in Galilee? He was born among the animals in the middle of nowhere, hung out with fishermen and simple folk, and he spoke of God through fables, not of philosophy, fables of birds and seeds and soil and wheat and fish and vineyards and sheep. The earliest images we have of Jesus, and the one on your right you're seeing here is from the 3rd century in the catacombs. The earliest images we have of Jesus depict him as the Good Shepherd, and he's surrounded by animals in a pastoral setting. So I want you to notice as well the earth-based spirituality that is implicit, perhaps hidden, but implicit within so many of the key biblical narratives. Time and time again, God is encountered in and through and in the midst of the more than human natural world. Moses hears the voice of God in a bush. Moses encounters the glory of God perched in the cleft of a rock. Moses receives instruction from God up to 8 times on the top of a mountain. Jacob before him wrestles with a divine figure beside a stream in the wilderness through the dark of night. Hagar, slave of Sarah, is visited by an angel of the Lord by a spring of water in the desert. Elijah on a mountain, standing before a great wind and an earthquake, then a fire, before God is present in the sound of sheer silence. Abraham, Joshua, Hosea, Ezekiel, Job, Deborah, Paul on the road to Damascus, time and time and time again, the most life-changing, vocation-informing, spiritually powerful, socially revolutionary encounters with divinity occur in the wild, amidst and from and within the land. So then, why do so many Christians today find themselves alienated from the earth, the ground of our being? Why this instinctive fear of any form of spirituality that looks and sounds and feels pagan? Well, here's where the invitation to those of us who are European Americans to do the work of uncovering our native ancestral roots is especially significant. Because again, remember, paganus simply means of the land, rural, rustic, country, native, earth-based. And it's used often as an epithet by those who see themselves as superior. So we need to ask, who benefits from the demonization of land-rooted peoples and their earth-based spiritualities? Well, the historical record is clear and consistent. Demonizing a land-based people's veneration of nature as primitive and evil and uncivilized has long served as justification for their displacement and even their eradication by those seeking conquest of the land for their own possession and profit. This was true for the 8th century prophets. It was true in the time of Jesus, and it was true throughout early medieval Europe. With the spread of the Holy Roman Empire, Carolingian Christianity, through the slaughtering of resistant populations, the cutting down of sacred groves, and the imposition of forced baptisms by threat of torture and death. It was true throughout the Middle Ages, through charges of religious heresy leveled against grassroots land-based movements like the Waldenses, the Taborites, the Apostolic Brethren, and later against the peasant uprisings of the Radical Reformation period. Social scientist and historian Silvia Federici notes that it's not an accident that the genocide of European peasants accused of witchcraft was particularly severe where the rebellions were fiercest. Women especially would have been the keepers of the old land-based wisdoms. They would have passed on knowledge of healing roots and herbs aligned with the lunar cycles. And because their daily lives and livelihoods were so intimately tied to the land, women often instigated and led the peasant revolts. Many of the techniques of torture developed in this time, Federici says, were then adapted and amplified in the conquest of the Americas and the brutalization of enslaved Africans. So at the same time, the European elite were profiting from the slave trade, and the conquistadors searched for gold in the supposed New World. At the same time, several 100,000 peasants in Europe, it is estimated, were being tried, tortured, burned alive, drowned, and hanged, with a primary target being rural women who were deemed witches, religious heretics, pagans. So here are these questions again. Why might we Christians, especially we Euro-American Christians, why might we possess deep in our bones an instinctive fear of being associated with anything that looks and sounds and feels like paganism? Who benefits from this fear? Whose interests are being served? And again, why do so many today find themselves alienated from a sacred connection with the earth? Well, I'll say it again. I am asking you, I am calling us as Christians in this time of profound planetary crisis to rekindle or to integrate something of the paganus spirit, the earth-based spirit, in your religious devotion and practice. I am calling us to become more intimately rooted spiritually in our environs. And here's the thing. Place-based, earth-based animist Christianity is not new. African Americans have been blending Pan-African tribal religious cosmologies, worship practices, and spiritual sensibilities with radical expressions of the gospel for as long as there have been Black Christians on this continent. For many Native American Christians, that means emphasizing the presence and the power of the Spirit in all our relations, human and more than human. It means seeing in Jesus a brother in solidarity against the forces of colonial conquest. It means seeing in Jesus a brother in hope for the healing of all nations and the earth. Well, what about those of us whose ancestries trace back to European geographies? I don't think it's an accident that so many Euro-American Christians drawn to nature spirituality find Celtic expressions of Christianity so helpful. I understand some of you have been reading John Philip Newell's Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, a lovely book that narrates the stories and the perspectives of different Christian figures who have all drawn deeply on the wisdom of Celtic spirituality. Newell notes that Celtic comes from the Greek Keltoi and Roman Galli or Gauls, which can be translated as stranger or the other. It would have been a broad term used to describe all of the peoples and tribes north of Italy, Greece, and Asia Minor. Galli, Galilee. And again, like the word pagan, it was typically used by those who saw themselves as culturally superior, in contrast to the wild savage, those primitive barbarians who lay beyond Greco-Roman civilization. In his book on Celtic Christianity, Father Timothy Joyce says that the Celts can be described as the European Aborigines. Like Native American tribes already on the land with their own developed culture prior to being conquered, driven out, or assimilated by more powerful invaders. Both Newell and Joyce point out that the areas where Celtic Christianity flourished, like Northern Britain, Scotland, and Ireland, these were all lands that were untouched by Roman imperial occupation, and only much later by Holy Roman Christianity, imperial Christianity. As a result, the Celtic Church, and this would have been true in Central Europe as well prior to Charlemagne, but the Celtic Church peacefully integrated pagan understandings and practices into a more holistic, creation-centered form of the Christian faith and life. And in these Christian traditions, communal acts of worship continued to be celebrated outdoors, aligned with the seasonal cycles. Particular sites like sacred springs, rivers, oak groves, fairy mounds, and uninhabited islands were venerated, not demonized. Jesus was depicted as the Druid Christ. Both feminine and masculine energies were held to be sacred and co-equal. And legends and tales preserved an older respect for humanity's kinship with animals, birds, fish, and the elements of wind, fire, earth, and water. As Newell writes in his introduction, in Celtic Christianity, we find an almost 2,000-year-old tradition that affirms that the earth is sacred, and that this sacredness is at the heart of every human being and life form. So I'll tell you what, if it's easier for you to claim you're a Christian, a Celtic Christian, rather than a pagan Christian, that's fine. But I want you to understand that the deep roots are the same. So what exactly then do I have in mind? What am I asking us to do? I am calling us to become spiritually native again to our places. I am calling us to become spiritually indigenous to the environs within which we quite literally live and move and have our being. Let me offer several concrete possibilities. First, by fostering a deep and an intimate spiritual reverence for all of life, cherishing the animating power of God within each life form, treating each species, each element, each flow of energy, every place as inherently sacred, deserving of respect, of attention, and awareness, and this is important, deserving of a relational ethic of mutuality and reciprocity. This means extending Jesus's call to love your neighbor as yourself to all persons, all others, human and more than human. And I mean this at the most immediate local level, not abstractly. Think globally, love locally. And genuine love seeks to know about and delight in the uniqueness of the other. So learn the names of the plants and the wildlife and the soil types and the rock formations and more right outside your front door, in your neighborhood, in your region. Find out what they need to flourish, what they need to live well, even happily. Figure out what is threatening them. and then be prepared to defend them, to give of yourself sacrificially so that they might live. And as you do so, you'll want to draw upon the knowledge of the natural sciences, earth system sciences, wildlife groups, and more. But remember to approach all of this in a spirit of contemplative delight. Avoid the turn to objective and objectifying distance. Allow yourself to fall in love and to be loved in return in ecological bonds of kinship. Second, we're going to need to recover and to create new liturgies and rituals and religious practices that are rooted in the land, in our local watersheds and bioregions. How might the hymns that we sing and the calls to worship we share in and the prayers of confession we offer and the collecting of gifts that we bring and the gathering of the elements we consume, how might all of these ground us more deeply in our local environs? What if at least once a quarter, if not more, we gathered to worship outside, joining our hearts and our voices in praise and thanksgiving with the trees and the prairie grasses and the songbirds and the creeks? Some of you may know that a growing number of those in the Wild Church Network are doing just this. wildchurchnetwork.com. And here I would recommend co-founder and friend Victoria Lure's book, Church of the Wild. Third, and this really should be first, learn as much as you can about the histories, past and present, of the first peoples of your area, those who were and are native to your region. Learn about the relations between native peoples of that land and those they consider native kin. Learn about the sacred sites, the cosmologies, and the ceremonies. Where are the tribal nations in your area? What are the indigenous-led organizations and wisdom keepers of the old ways? And let's caution ourselves here to do this not in the paternalistic mindset of those who think themselves superior, or even of those who come out of a sense of charity, but in fact, quite the opposite, as those in desperate need of the advanced knowledge of how to live rightly with all our relations in the particular places we inhabit. Do so with a solemn recognition of just how much has been lost, a readiness to do the hard work that would culminate in reparative action, and a determined commitment to join with those seeking to preserve and pass on the old traditions. Here I would commend, yes, Vine Deloria Jr., but also George Tinker, Randy Woodley as theologians. And if you haven't yet read Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweet Grass, you need to do so soon. Fourth, I would invite you to do the work of uncovering your own ancestral roots. Trace back best you can to the geographies and the lands where your peoples were once native. Learn about their sacred traditions, their earth-based religious practices, but also learn about the processes and dynamics of displacement, of the historical traumas, of the patterns of conquest, that led your ancestors, either as perpetrators or as victims, or perhaps both, to leave their indigenous lands to settle in a new one. For those of us with European ancestral roots, whose complex histories likely contain the both and of unsettlement and settler conquest, I can't recommend enough Elaine Enns and Chet Myers' book, Healing Haunted Histories, a settler discipleship of decolonization. Finally, be aware. Stay on guard of those who would denigrate an earth-based, land-based spiritual life, whether that voice comes from without or perhaps yet still from within. Ask yourself, in an age of runaway climate change and biodiversity collapse, what is more spiritually dangerous? To adopt a basic reverence for all life, as Albert Schweitzer encouraged, or to continue on a path towards Earth's denigration and destruction? Which of these paths is in fact demonic? Of course, there's so much more to be said and there's so much more to be done. And this perhaps isn't the lecture that you were expecting. I didn't tell you to create a green team. I didn't recommend that you connect with the growing United Methodist Creation Justice movement. I didn't talk about getting organized politically to pressure politicians and political parties to act decisively on the climate emergency. Please understand that I want you to do all of that and much more. What I'm inviting all of us to do, amidst all of that, and it all needs to be done, what I'm inviting us to do is to embrace a spiritual vision and to practice a spiritual life that grounds us in the earth from which we were and are formed, and that connects us to the animating presence and power of Spirit at the heart of it all. I'm asking us simply to follow Jesus, the Galilean, like the prophets before and after him, into the wilderness, away from the logics of imperial domination, to retreat to the mountains, to depart to the lake shores, to withdraw to the sacred groves. And that may be outside the city, but it might be in your backyard. And there, to pray, to listen, to commune with God, and then to discern, not just for yourself, but for the people, at a time of such great uncertainty, to discern what is the right and the good and the faithful thing to do. May it be so.
Tim, thank you so much. We're going to move toward a time of question and answer. What we're going to try and do, and I think this will work, will be for you to use the handheld mic that Eric is going to bring around to you. And we'll see if, Tim, if you can hear that without he having to repeat the question.
Thank you for your very insightful comments and reflections on history. With a paraphrase of what you said be something like this: the advances in technology, which are the responsibility of human ingenuity, intellect, be a bad thing in terms of the future course of the Earth?
I would say the question isn't whether humans ought to use technology to continue to innovate and to create. The question is, are our technologies rooted in a logic of domination and control of the earth, or are our technologies aligned with a deep intimacy with, a partnership with the rhythms and the needs of the earth? So human civilizations have sustained life in particular environs for thousands of years with appropriate technologies, technologies that were regenerative, that allowed for the fruition, the harvest, the replanting of life-sustaining plants, seeds, medicines, and more. What we see emerging out of these logics of domination, particularly from the dominant traditions of the West, including scientific traditions, are logics, and we see it in Francis Bacon, we see it in John Locke. We see a logic that views nature as lifeless, as inert, as to be controlled and dominated and extracted from solely for the sake of human beings, understood to be at the very top of a kind of a great chain of being, a hierarchy of being. And so indigenous technologies or biomimicry or sustainable regenerative technologies are all forms of techne that are aligned with the earth, that are respectful of its rhythms. And so if I heard your question rightly, and apologies if I didn't, if I heard you rightly, for me, the question isn't one of technology or not, but it's what kind of technology.
My question is, I didn't hear you mention as a traditional society Judaism, and I'm just wondering if you would tease it out, or was it not mentioned intentionally, or what are your thoughts on it? Thank you.
In some ways, I'd invite you, and I'm getting this from a African theologian, Mercy Odeyuye, who invites us to think about the Hebrew scriptures as the indigenous traditions of a people, and the New Testament as the integration of and a continuation of that wisdom, that knowledge, that spirituality with the Jesus tradition. And so too, and when you think of it that way, you begin to see the sacred sites, you begin to see the theophanies, you begin to see the shamanic practices, you begin to see a lot of, quote, indigenous ways of thinking and indigenous pieties throughout the Hebrew scriptures. She similarly then says, and she extends it then to African tribal traditions, inviting African Christians to similarly integrate the Jesus tradition with the older African tribal traditions. I'm saying something similar was going on in Celtic Christianity, right? You can think of the, quote, pagan or the pre-Christian native European traditions as the Old Testament for European peoples. And in the peaceful integration of Celtic Christianity, we see that harmonious weaving together of the Jesus tradition and the native earth-based traditions. And so for me, in the same way that over the last 50 years or even 100 years, contemporary Christian theologians, biblical scholars have insisted that Jesus cannot be understood, and we Christians dare not practice Christianity alienated from our Jewish roots. I'm actually inviting something similar for all people who consider themselves Christian to more deeply understand our ancestral roots, our earth-based heritages and wisdoms, and find ways of weaving them together. Similarly, in the same way that Christian-Jewish dialogue has become central to much contemporary Christian understanding and practice and justice-based work, I would say there's an opening for Christian pagan, Christian indigenous, Christian Native American dialogue, and much of that has been already occurring. But for us to deepen that dialogue, that mutual understanding, and in some cases for we Christians, and particularly we white Christians, adopting a deep sense of penitence, confession, and reconciliation in that work.
Hi Tim, my name is Jimmy and I'm a pastor in Bloomington, Indiana. I'm prefacing that way because the mayor of Bloomington is here and I'm going to bring something up that's going to give him a PTSD reaction. But we have a really great farmers market in Bloomington, and there was a vendor there a couple of years ago who was an organic farmer, but also was identified with Europa identity, whatever it was called, about, she was very interested in moving back into Nordic tradition, but she was pretty clearly a white nationalist in that vein. And I think for those of us who are probably not as practiced in looking back into pagan traditions productively, I'm just telling that story. I guess I'm wondering, are there ways to suggest ways that our congregations could do that productively, even while knowing that there is this other stream that does it to retrieve something pretty unholy?
I'm so glad you brought that up. I had that in my address, but I was mindful of time, and so I took it out. But you are precisely right. Perhaps the most vigorous, unfortunately, recovery among Euro-Americans and white-skinned persons throughout the West of pagan, pre-Christian pagan European traditions are among white racist, white supremacist nationalists. And my theory on this is, and we saw it, this was certainly true in Nazi Germany, of the romanticization of the Aryan mythologies, right? The strong man, the warrior gods. First of all, I'd say those recoveries, not surprisingly, fixate on the warrior god traditions, and they leave out many of the feminine goddess images and more diverse forms that were prevalent, and the egalitarian, mutualistic, cooperative elements of indigenous traditions worldwide. But my theory here is that for white Americans and white-skinned peoples worldwide, the severance from deeper belonging, deeper traditions, deeper community has strengthened the impulse precisely to belong, to have an identity, to go back and to find one's place. Those are powerful energies. But if we leave that work only to those who distort it through racism, through misogyny, through fascist political impulses, I think we will fail to provide alternatives that are rooted in paths of healing, of racial justice and reconciliation, of deep earth-based, place-based spirituality. So this warrants a much longer conversation. It's something that I'll be writing about. It's part of a larger project, but I'm very glad you brought it up, because we see it not just in kind of white nationalist pagan recovery, we see it in certain kind of white fascist environmental terms that recognize actually recognize the science around climate change, but whose answers are not to deepen democracy. They are to enclose even deeper into shelters of whiteness and shared wealth only among one's own people. Those are terms that we vigorously need to resist.
Hi, my name is Alan, and my profession is in therapy, especially working with trauma. And just as I was hearing you talk, I was thinking about how in the therapy world, there's the industrial therapy complex values managing symptoms through cognitive behavioral therapy. But there is a strong undercurrent that is seeking healing, that is much more about experiential therapies, somatic therapies, even activity-based things like yoga and dance and drama. And I just wondered if you would, I mean, I was associating that with some of what you were talking, and I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's lovely. And that tracks so much of our therapeutic interventions, whether in a clinical setting or a congregational setting or elsewhere, is treating the symptoms but not the deeper roots. And that's part of what I'm inviting us to do, is to deepen, to heal these deeper roots of severance, of alienation, that are spiritual, that are religious, that are connected to our loss of contact with land, place, belonging. And, you know, I don't think we need science to confirm this, but science is confirming that when our skin touches the soil, antidepressant properties are communicated into the human body. An ionic charge is, there's a balancing that takes place when human skin touches the soil. So the feeling of, boy, I've spent the day outside and I just feel more grounded. I feel more like myself. Science is confirming that there's an interchange between the earth and the human body that takes place. All kinds of psychological benefits, mental health, spiritual benefits are bound up in time outside. And again, we know this intuitively, and this is the wisdom of all older wisdom traditions. So in this time of such profound instability, with the unraveling of so many stable institutions, in a time of a sharp rise of depression and anxiety among our young people, but all generations, among the many responses, reconnecting with the earth is one of the deepest and perhaps even most effective.
Question here, since we are 1 week away from our Jewish friends starting Sukkot, it seems to me that we are much more aware of how much this is related rather than to Thanksgiving that we use, to God's gift to us from earth that our Thanksgiving is. Could you comment on that a little bit?
I'd be happy to. It's another example of like in all indigenous traditions of every continent, religious festivals tied to the cycles of the earth, cycles of nature. And so the Sukkot tradition of harvest, in Europe, it would have been the Samhain traditions around the time of what we now celebrate as Halloween. That these religious cycles that followed the cycles of the turning of the seasons. I think this is the lectionary, the cycles of the church calendar follow upon many of these European-based older traditions. So these are natural places for us to integrate, to recover our pagan roots, and for those whose ancestry traced not back to Europe, but to Africa or South America or elsewhere, to similarly find ways of and many do, of integrating the Christian calendar with earlier place-based calendars. So I think these are wonderful opportunities and ways that organically have in many cases always been part of our worship life, our communal congregational life, a place for us to reconnect, realign with the rhythms of nature. I think we can do so with even more intentionality and awareness, though.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for being with us. We wish you well.
Thank you. I appreciate it again so much. I very much wish I could have been there with you again. I had a marvelous time several years ago. But I appreciate the fact that you're hosting this weekend, and please know that I am with you in spirit and in body here in this important work, and happy to be an ongoing conversation partner with any of you as we seek to recover these traditions and all traditions committed to the healing of the earth. So thank you.
As a follow-up, Tim, a couple of years ago, a wonderful article that you contributed to Missio Dei in the United States, that book. I'm going to share that with the congregation as a PDF. I'll send it to Eric, and he can get out and read to anybody else that wants it. In that particular essay that Tim has done is looking from a very specific Methodist Wesleyan lens about this. It's a nice take on what is an alternative way of understanding holiness around this as well, and it seems of what we're going to talk about. So that'd be a good follow-up for you to read some of this work. Again, thank you so much, Tim, and we wish you well. Just a word from Eric.
Two quick announcements. If you were one of our speakers today, please feel free to go right now and get your lunch. It's in the back of the room so that you can be at a table. For the rest of you, those speakers will be at tables with name tags so that you can sit with them and ask them questions about their various topics that they spoke to. There are also 6 tables, I think it is, or 5 tables, no, 6 tables around the room for you to visit. One is Faith in Place, our interfaith regional environmental organization. Back there's one of those fancy composting machines that Heather talked about in her talk, I think. Worms are up here, invasive plant stuff here, the curriculum stuff there, and Becky Archibald's details about her compositions are down there so that you can visit all those tables and learn more about those things as well.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer a brief blessing over the food. And then feel free, before you get your lunch, to, as I like to say, dehydrate and close the table. Let's pray. Oh, great Creator, we give you thanks for the goodness of the land, for those who prepared this meal for it. May it nourish our bodies as our conversation nourishes our soul. Amen. Amen. Thanks so much.